Hi, everyone, and welcome to our 11th virtual happy hour conversation about issues at the intersection of law, politics, and culture. I'm Jennifer Braceras with Independent Women's Law Center. It's Thursday at 5 o'clock, and you are at the bar.
I'm Inez Stepman with Independent Women's Forum. And today we're going to be focusing on some of the legal and moral questions surrounding drafting women into the military. So that's going to be our main subject. But first, we wanted to kick it back to our previous episode, episode 8 of At the Bar, where we had a little discussion about Britney Spears and her conservatorship.
Yeah, earlier this summer, Inez and I had a spirited discussion, pun intended, about Britney Spears' conservatorship and the legal rights of parents over their adult children, particularly mentally ill children. And as you know, ever since her very public breakdown 13 years ago, Britney Spears has been under a conservatorship controlled largely by her father. This year, Britney broke her silence and petitioned the court to forego a psychiatric evaluation and end the conservatorship, essentially no questions asked.
So, recently, her father, Jamie Spears, has actually agreed to her request. So on Tuesday, he filed a petition to end that conservatorship. I know, Jennifer, you were one of the only people, everybody was all free Britney, and Jennifer was like, wait, this may not be the greatest idea. So I wonder if I guess what you think happened here now that Jamie Spears is essentially giving up his side of this fight. And has it made you change your mind, or do you think this is publicity, or what do you think is going on here?
I think it's really interesting because just a few short weeks ago, Jamie Spears was saying, look, the world doesn't really know what's going on. You don't know my daughter. You don't know how sick she is. You only have a glimpse of it, and it's much worse than you see. And all of a sudden, he reversed course. I think he basically just buckled to the public pressure. I think it's a testament to the power of public relations and grassroots advocacy, if you want to call it that. Courts aren't supposed to buckle to those kind of things, but the reality is that Britney launched a very public and very effective campaign. And, Jamie Spears is right. None of us, except Britney and her family and the people who work in that household, really know what's going on. And, it was very hard for her father, I think, and her other relatives and managers and people who care about her to tell their side of the story. So I think this was sort of inevitable. And we'll see what happens. Frankly, I think she's headed for a very public and very, disappointing fall that's probably going to play out for all the world to see, but I wish her nothing but the best.
Well, obviously, I think everyone wishes her the best in this. I actually don't necessarily disagree with you. I'm sure that there are some reasons behind this conservatorship. I just think that a conservatorship for a woman in her mid-30s, late 30s is probably too extreme a legal solution. Especially when you consider how many people in the public eye do crazy things every day. Mm-hmm. And then of course, I haven't really changed my mind, I guess, when it comes to the impact of money in all of this. So apparently Jamie Spears has spent about $1.5 million trying to keep this conservatorship. That's $1.5 million of Britney's money, right? Trying to keep this conservatorship in place, including almost $500,000 on his own PR services. That really backs up your point to the point that at least to the role that the public and the public furor has played in all of this. The fact that it's about a third of his costs has gone towards PR and public facing relations. But I just think the additional factor of the fact that she is a famous pop star who has millions and millions of dollars and the potential to make many millions more just really complicates this whole situation. But if you were tuning in for our Free Britney or anti-Free Britney takes from the last at the bar episode, we figured we would give you that riveting update on the Free Britney situation. But our main topic this episode is going to be drafting women into the military. So we're going to switch gears and talk about that. We're talking about involuntarily drafting women to serve in the military. So this issue has been back in the news recently because both the House and the Senate House Armed Services Committees have now approved an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that would require women to register for the Selective service, i.e. the draft that every man, when he turns 18 in America, is registered for, or has to register for. So here's a brief news clip from earlier in the summer after the committee took up this issue to remind us all of what's going on.
A new bill before Congress would require young women for the first time to register for the draft just like young men. ABC's Mary Alice Parks is on Capitol Hill this morning with the latest on this legislation. Good morning, Mary Alice.
Good morning, Eva. Yeah, this is interesting and would be a first. Now, it's been nearly 50 years since the government has actually inducted someone into the military through the draft, but still, young men have to register after they turn 18. And now Congress is again talking about whether women should have to, too.
Capitol Hill poised to make history. The Senate Armed Services Committee advancing a bill that, if signed into law, would require young women for the first time to register for the draft at 18, just like their dads and brothers. The last time the government actually drafted a non-voluntary civilian into the armed services was back in 1973 during the Vietnam War. Last year, then candidate Joe Biden saying a draft is not needed now, but that he would, quote, ensure that women are also eligible to register for the Selective service system so that men and women are treated equally in the event of future conflicts. On the National Mall, some worried faces, but many women and men conceding the idea felt fair.
We are living in the 21st century where men and women are to be considered equal, then we have to be considered equal on all fronts.
If it was a draft that included young men and young women, that seems appropriate and fair.
I think that's fair. I do. I think women are being included in everything, and hopefully we don't end up in a situation where we ever need the draft again.
But not everyone is on board with the idea of adding women to the draft. Republican Senator Josh Hawley writing, compelling women to fight our wars is wrong.
Now, some recent polls show that slightly more Americans favor this idea, but it's close.
Jennifer, why don't you give us a little bit of background on the law in this case, and then we'll talk about that concept, which I think is so central to this issue of fairness. Like, what does fairness or equality between men and women actually mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this has been on the agenda of the left-wing feminist movement for quite some time, actually. And there actually was a lawsuit back in the 80s. In 1981, it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rejected a constitutional challenge to the all-male selective service. In that case, people might have heard of it. It's called Roscoe versus Goldberg. The court based its reasoning in part on the fact that there were no women in combat at the time. So essentially, well, what would be the point of drafting them if they don't go into combat? Now, today, women do serve in combat. And so the question is whether that holding is still valid. The Supreme Court had a chance to address that issue and declined cert in a case that raised that very issue earlier this summer, essentially asking Congress to deal with the issue. And I'll read a little bit from a statement that was issued by Justice Sotomayor. Again, it was not an opinion because the court denied certiorari, declined to take up the case. But Justice Sotomayor wrote, joined by Justice Breyer and Justice Kavanaugh, she said, quote, "The role of women in the military has changed dramatically since the court decided Roscoe. As of 2015, there are no longer any positions in the United States Armed Forces closed to women. In 2016, Congress created the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service and tasked it with studying the issue. On March 25th, 2020, it recommended eliminating the male-only registration. It remains to be seen, of course, whether Congress will end gender-based registration under the Military Selective Service Act. But at least for now, the court's longstanding deference to Congress on matters of national defense and military affairs cautions against granting review while Congress actively weighs the issue. I agree with the court's decision to deny the petition for a writ of certiorari. Now, to me, that's a very unusual statement from a court, one justice joined by a few others. And to me, it sounds like she's saying, Congress, do your job or we will. So now Congress is doing just that. They're considering this issue, and it looks like they may be poised to pass it in the coming weeks.
This issue really, I think, gets to the heart of what it means for men and women to be equal under the law. And you saw in that ABC clip, right? There is this instinctive feeling, even among a lot of people on the right, I think, that if women are going to be treated as men for everything that is positive in life, if we're going to treat women's careers equally to men's and so on and so forth, that, this is something that women are going to have to deal with. But then on the flip side, there's this very real biological reality that women, for most combat positions, the vast, vast majority of women are not biologically suited to a lot of the rigors of combat. And that's without getting into some of the issues with morale and cohesion. But it's true. I mean, the court is right to a certain degree. If we allow women at all into these combat positions, the very small number of women who want to serve in those combat positions, if we allow them to serve, then it's hard to say. I mean, there are plenty of young men who don't want to be drafted and wouldn't want to go to war, right? So, I guess I can see both sides legally of this, even though I guess I see this as a inevitable consequence of our legal regime now that increasingly more and more treats men and women as though there are no biological distinctions between them, and that it's invalid or discriminatory to recognize the fact that men and women are different. But here's what
it goes to a conversation that you and I have all the time, and it impacts so many different issues, whether it's transgender participation in women's sports or women in the military, or a whole host of issues that IWF weighs in on. Because really the fundamental underlying issue behind all of this is, what does the word equal mean? Does equal mean the same, or does it mean that people who are similarly situated are treated the same? And that's what it really comes down to. There are, 5, 6, 7, 8 issues that essentially where people stand depends on the answer to that question. And so I would argue that's really the fundamental feminist issue of our day. What does equal mean? Does it mean the same, or does it mean something different?
Yeah, and there were obviously, as the ABC package noted, there has been pushback from some Republicans and some on the right. Congressman Chip Roy, who, in full disclosure, is a friend of mine. I love this guy, and he must have been real mad because he doesn't often swear. But he wrote on Twitter, "Abolish the draft if you want, but under no circumstances will you draft our wives and daughters. Total complete beep."
Hashtag don't draft our daughters.
So there definitely has been sort of a gut level pushback on this issue from some on the right. But now we would like to invite up a couple of lovely ladies to have this discussion with us. I can't think of folks better to have this discussion with us. Lauren Adams currently serves as the legal director for the Women's Liberation Front, otherwise known as WOLF. She has nearly a decade of legal experience with a focus on serving the needs of women, and she's worked on all kinds of these issues that relate to how women are treated under the law. So she'll be a wonderful addition to this discussion. And in addition, we have Jennifer Chavez, who has served on WOLF's board of directors from 2016 through 2020. She's helped coordinate WOLF's early legal strategies in response to the Obama and Trump administration's policies on gender identity. So again, that same focus of what does being female mean under the law, and what in what circumstances can the law distinguish between men and women? But she's a lawyer with 17 years of experience representing a variety of conservation groups specializing in administrative and environmental law. So she has a long legal background. So before we delve into the issue of the draft, Lauren, tell us just a little bit about Wolf and what your guys' mission is.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Wolf is a radical feminist nonprofit, and we focus on serving the needs of women and girls and defending them in the law. And we focus on areas that are sort of left behind or even in disagreement with other mainstream feminists. So, for example, we oppose gender identity being put into the law and any legislation or policy that turns single-sex spaces into mixed-sex spaces on the basis of gender identity. We also work against male violence, and we oppose the sex trade, surrogacy, pornography, prostitution, other areas of reproductive and sexual exploitation of women and extracting those resources from women.
This will be a really interesting discussion because, as Lauren knows, because we've chatted about it before, I don't consider myself a feminist. I'm actually not sure how Jennifer feels about it, or either one of the Jennifers feels about how they self-identify. Actually, Jennifer Chavez, you must identify as a feminist. It's in the organization name, but it should be a really interesting discussion because, as you can see, there's this sort of gut level pushback against this registration of women for the Selective Service by what might be called like the socially conservative right. And I'm wondering maybe for the first question, if either Lauren or Jennifer, you can speak to this. What are your positions, or both of you? What are your positions on this law? Do you think that it ignores those biological realities which you guys are so often pointing to in mixed space context and in the prisons context, or do you think that this is more of a matter that's more gray and actually does have to do with the advancement of women into combat positions in the military? I genuinely don't know what either of you thinks about this, so I'm really curious to find out.
I can take a shot at that. So Wolf has not taken a formal position on this particular act, but Wolf's underlying principles really inform the analysis. And I think we would probably have a lot more in common with you two than we would with so-called mainstream liberal feminists on this question. So one of the key questions that you raised, Jennifer, is the question of what equality under the law means, or I think more concretely, the question of whether courts can and must take into consideration the differences between the concrete physical differences between males and females in applying laws where the differences really do matter. And so, of course, one of Wolf's main stakes in this question revolves around all of these recent gender identity laws, which really raise the same question: can the courts take into account material differences between males and females? One of the things that is really troubling in the history of this question about the draft is that a lot of the discussion really does proceed along the lines of feelings and gut level responses, rather than looking at the facts at hand, the factual differences between men and women, and also the purposes of the draft and the purposes of the military. I think it's fair to say that Wolf's position on military involvement is goes into deeper levels of our fundamental principles about opposition to any type of male violence, and I think most of our members would consider most military action to be a form of male violence when looked at sort of in the big picture. But I don't think that removes us from this debate. I mean, this really, again, it comes down to how does the law look at the differences between men and women. And, one of the, I think you mentioned, Jennifer, in the history of this debate since the 1980 law, it sparked a series of events. Congress at one point appointed a commission to to examine the question of whether women should be in the draft. And one thing that really stood out to me from that commission report, it's I believe it's cited by Justice Sotomayor in her statement. Here it is. The statement quotes from this commission report, and the report says, male-only registration sends a message to women, not only that they are not vital to the defense of the country, but also that they're not expected to participate in defending it, right? So it's this concept of sending a message to women. And, what really stood out to me is that, the purpose of the draft is not to send a message. It's not to validate people's feelings or to make people feel that they're being treated equally. It is to create a supply line of combat, military warriors. I think, the question needs to move beyond this gut level impulse about equality. And you can kind of see the people in that interview really sort of reacting almost, as though they're taken off guard, but their initial impulse is to say, well, gee, that's fair. But, the initial impulse is not always what's right. And so I think that,
right. I think an interesting point is, people need to consider what a draft actually is and what it is actually used for. It is not national service. A draft is only implemented when we're in a major national emergency, when tens of thousands of people are dying on the front lines every day and we need bodies to replace them. We're not drafting people, to take dictation, and we're not drafting people, for other more civilian roles. We are drafting them essentially, to replace people who are dying on the front lines. And so the question is, I think it's very easy to say, oh yes, everything should be equal, when we don't actually have a draft. We have the Selective Service, we have registration for the draft, but nobody is currently being drafted. And so in some sense, it's very performative, these statements that everybody should be treated equal and men and women should both have to sign up for this thing, but we're not really talking about what this thing is and what it would mean for women.
Honestly, I would really like to see the reaction of some of these same women on the street if it actually came down to them or their daughters being drafted into an active war. But I think you bring up a really good point, Jennifer, and that is some people respond to this by saying, well, the military is very modern. There are a lot of positions that aren't direct combat positions. And I find myself sympathetic that if we were in such dire straits so as to require a draft, that we might need to draft women into non-combat positions, of which there are many in the military. But that brings up yet another level of fairness, right? It's certainly not the whole point of having a number, right, for the draft, and the whole point of making it a lottery based solely on fitness, right? You qualify or you don't, and then your number comes out of the hat or it doesn't. There's an element of unfairness in perhaps an adjustment to the draft that might say, okay, well, women, you're eligible to be drafted into these non-combat positions. That means a larger proportion of draftees who are drafted into the combat positions are going to be men. I mean, how is that fairness? That's a response that I've heard a lot. But Lauren, what are your thoughts on the Selective Service and on starting to register women the way that both of the committees in the Senate and in the House seem okay with?
Yeah, I agree with everything Jennifer Chavez. So I also would just add, we have pretty strong positions on bodily sovereignty for women, and that extends just beyond what people would consider pro-choice. And so in terms of being literally drafted into fighting wars, that really is pretty contrary to our ideas about male decisions being made about women's bodies. And, I think that that's really antithetical to a lot of what we work for. this is a little tangential, but I noticed during the clip that there was a quote, I think it was from Biden maybe, where he talked about how having like the right to participate or like to be eligible to participate in selective service. I think that is so symptomatic of what we're dealing with on all of these issues is the language that we're using to talk about it is so Orwellian.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
Nobody wants to be drafted. So, you're eligible to be forced. The opportunity to be told that you need to go and so I just think it reminded me of these other issues we get into with a lot of like these other areas, the sex work and gender identity and all of these other things that are they make it sound like these things that are good for women, and they're usually bad for women if we have to make up new meanings to words. So
yeah.
I heard,
by the same token, it's not. People may forget. They may sort of conflate in their minds the draft or the registration of selective service just with the ability to serve, and it should really be underlined that there is, other than the obvious physical requirements that you have to meet, there's no limitation on women voluntarily choosing to serve and voluntarily going and doing their best to try to even meet physical requirements that would make them eligible for combat. What we're talking about is conscription, basically. So it's, this idea of fairness, I think is maybe coming from just a general, lack of knowledge about how the military works for most people. Maybe a lack of understanding of the fact that, women really are serving, quite broadly, voluntarily, and that this wouldn't change that at all.
And I do think it's worth noting too that the feminist groups and the idea behind supporting like draft equity comes from a good place. It comes from a place of we really want to achieve this equality, and this is like the way to do it. And so that instinct to want to say like where we can, let's break down these barriers of these distinctions, I think for the most part comes from a place of really wanting to advocate for women. But I just think it's really misguided in this case, as in many other cases on that. And Jennifer made the point about just appeal to emotion, and I think that that's really the case. We see that with the ERA and the Equality Act and all of these other things where, wouldn't it just be nice if everybody was nice to each other and everything was inclusive and everything's exactly the same, and that's just not how things work in the real world. So we can't rely on those ideals to how we function in society.
Right. I think I agree that it's important to recognize, sort of steelman the argument. I mean, we've seen so much ridiculous nonsense coming from mainstream feminists in recent years that it's getting a little, it's getting easy for me to just, assume, almost just to assume bad faith and to assume that they're just being silly all of the time. It is worthwhile to stop in and recognize the legitimate impulses that might be behind a member of the public, ordinary member of the public, thinking this is the right path to fairness, right? I mean, there is an actual history of, guilds and other sorts of structures being put into place to exclude women from, from professions. And there's a history of men claiming to want to quote protect women, and when you ask them how they're protecting us, their answers usually revolve around sort of gestures of chivalry, like opening doors for us and things that we really aren't protective. And meanwhile, the areas where we're asking for help, protection from domestic violence and things like this, women, you can understand why some women would grow to be very, very suspicious of claims from conservatives or anyone, for men in general, to want to be protecting women. But again, that's you can't stop there. I mean, that's the initial emotional impulse, but then you have to really look further and ask, regardless of anyone's intent, what is going to be the actual effect on women? That's really what we should be most concerned about as the sort of, the reasonable adults in the room, is, setting aside gut level impulses and suspicions about people's motivations. What are the real world effects on women going to be of this?
Well, and the real world effect is, now that we allow women to choose combat, if you were to implement a draft, then some women would be drafted into combat. That is the reality of that. People can agree or disagree on whether or not they think that's a good thing, but we have to at least start from the premise that is what will happen, and not delude ourselves into thinking that it's okay because they'll all be given desk jobs. I did hear one person talking about this the other day, and this is a former veteran, and she said it was sort of interesting to her that because we don't currently have a draft, she thinks that what this really is sort of a backdoor way to usher in some sort of national service program. So we get everybody to register, male and female, and we don't have a draft, but you know what? Now we're going to use it for the Green New Deal or whatever else, and force people into some form of national service, the way public schools now force people to have a certain number of public service hours to graduate, and some schools even designate what types of activities are legitimate or illegitimate for service hours. So I thought that was an interesting take on it. I hadn't heard anybody else say that. I wonder what anybody on our panel here today thinks about that.
That is an interesting take, and now that I've finished giving people the benefit of the doubt and steel manning their arguments, now it's time to be a bit cynical, right, or skeptical. And I think that I would say that possibility does not strike me as implausible. It could be part of the motivation. I'm also concerned about this this thing that we've alluded to throughout the discussion, that one of the motivations behind this, this may start to get a little bit conspiratorial, but this is the ACLU representing the National Coalition for Men, I believe, National Coalition for Men.
Right. Who are those people, and why do they have a coalition? Why do they need a coalition?
Well, it's those people. I could talk all day about men's rights advocacy groups, but think about the ACLU. They have been pushing so many cases to try to get into jurisprudence the concept that there really is no significant difference between men and women. Male and female are just states of mind. And so, yeah, I'm very suspicious about the, in fact, it makes me a little bit more worried that it's symbolic, because in a way, the primary motivation, if it's really symbolic, would have to be just achieving a change in the law. And one of those changes will be, again, chipping away at the court's ability and willingness to recognize real material physical differeries between males and females.
I think that's right, Jennifer.
Sorry,
I'm just agreeing with you. I think that's absolutely right. I think that, we see the same arguments for the ERA, that it's symbolic, that it's important that we write these words into the Constitution, but in reality, what's going to happen is it'll be one more either law or decision, depending on how or amendment, what form of this idea that men and women are identical we're talking about. It'll be one more thing for courts to point to say, well, the law doesn't recognize the distinctions between men and women here, so why should it recognize the distinctions between men and women in prison or in restrooms or in 100 other areas in sports, right? It's all at root a reluctance to recognize that equality between men and women is, I'm getting in trouble for saying this, but is in many ways a legal fiction, right? In terms of the fact that these biological differences are real and meaningful. Now, they don't impact everything. They don't impact every decision a woman or man makes in his or her life, but they are meaningful. And there are certain situations where they become critical, not just to
Inez,
privacy, but to
I've heard
safety.
you make the point many times that men and women are legally equal, and legal equality means that we are equal before the eyes of the law. That when we are similarly situated, we are equal before the eyes of the law. So when it comes to things like, the ability to do, an intellectual task or what have you, the law treats us the same. When it has to do with our rights as citizens, say to vote, for example, or to exercise any other constitutional right, the law treats us the same because we are similarly situated for those purposes. But where we are not physically the same, where we are not similarly situated in terms of biology, the law needs to take that into consideration. And so we do have true equality before the law right now. And I think the big push is actually to make us unequal by treating us exactly the same all the time. Because if you treat us the same all the time, how is that treating us equally? Are we equally as likely to get injured in combat? No, we're not. We're much more likely to get injured and killed than men are.
Right. And it's so interesting to see that some of the rhetoric coming from this men's rights group is very similar to the rhetoric that comes from trans rights activists. So in their I believe it was in their petition for cert to the Supreme Court, the men's rights group argues not just that sorry, what was it? The Supreme Court case, Rosker. They don't just argue that things have changed now and women are doing combat, therefore Rosker, that the factual underpinnings of Rosker have fallen away. They argue that, but they also argue that Rosker was wrongly decided in the first place. And the language that really struck me is they say that Rosker relied on archaic and overbroad generalizations, or that arguments to the contrary, not necessarily the case itself, but arguments against women in the draft, rely on, quote, archaic and overbroad generalizations about women's preferences. And then another quote, they say that those generalizations were, quote, an accidental byproduct of a traditional way of thinking about females rather than a robust studied position, right? So they're very much, they're using, it's sort of this perverse misapplication of feminist sounding language that they're using to portray the differences between men and women for purposes of the draft as merely about women's preferences or merely about stereotypes about females. And that's exactly the kind of argument that we get when we, when we say that women need safe and secure private places to use toilets and changing rooms and prisons. There's this perverse reversal where we're told that we are just stereotyping women as the weaker sex, but meanwhile, women are weaker, physically weaker. Women are unable to resist, a physical assault in the way that a man. Women are, as you all have observed, women are much more vulnerable. There's certain types of injuries that they're likely to receive in combat. They're less likely to carry the kinds of weights that they're expected to. And so, this is not about women's preferences or about stereotypes. I mean, this is about real concrete, material circumstances, life and death. And even if it doesn't get to that point, I mean, you don't necessarily have to picture the woman in the field who can't keep up or who, loses in a knife fight to some, terrorist or something. even before that point, you have to ask what kind of resources are going to be involved in testing all these women who we already know, are not able to achieve the same types of physical, strength and endurance type tests that they're subject to in the military. Are we really going to do that in order to, quote, send the right message? Even for a person who is adamantly anti-war, anti-military, that's a foolish way of spending resources if you're going to be spending resources at all.
Well, not to harp too much on the ACLU, although I could do that all day, but they are, the way they talk about these things is so bizarre to me. And I always think about how, and when we were researching the ERA for the materials that we had released on it, someone found a quote from the ACLU in their annual report from 1955, where they come out against the ERA. And they do so when they specifically say that that equality does not mean full mathematical equality, and that having something, having something like the ERA in place, like, could actually prevent us from having desirable laws that distinguish between men and women, basically. So I'm like, well, what happened? And it just makes me think too of all their positions on everything else. They have a document called Schools in Transition that they did with the NEA and with HRC and have disseminated to K-12 schools on, diversity and inclusion stuff on gender identity. And they actually argue in there, they say this, and this is distributed to our children's schools, that sex separation in sports is based on old notions about women's abilities, and that having these notions is harmful to girls. And they basically make those arguments too. Their Women's Rights Project has taken a position against sex separated schools, which are voluntary, that they shouldn't even exist. You shouldn't even have the option, because it's based on these other ideas.
There is a whole body of scholarship. I mean, people might think it's fringe, but it's gaining currency. This whole body of scholarship that argues against single-sex sport altogether. They want only open competition, and this is a number of feminist writers who claim that if women had to compete with men, and this has nothing to do with trans or anything like that, it just has to do with open sport versus sex segregated sport. These people argue that, if women were allowed to compete with men, they would have the confidence to compete with men, and eventually they would be able to win competitions against men, and they would have as many awards as men, and that gender and sex would have nothing to do with it. And it sounds fringe, but Google it. It's gaining currency. It's not just in the law reviews anymore. There are people writing about this in Newsweek and mainstream publications. So I actually think that the whole, and this is deviating from our topic of the military, but the whole trans inclusion in women's sports for some people is really just a vehicle to eliminate single-sex sport altogether and to eliminate women as a distinct legal category.
Right when we got finally got our rights for the first time and place in history, really, in these last decades, to actually have, like you said, equality under the law. And can't go forward with that. Or prisons, we get into these arguments on the prison thing where people say, well, why don't we just separate by risk level and this and that? And it's like, well, yeah, we can do that by that and sex. There's still no reason why. It's all the same conversations, and I also sometimes feel conspiratorial about it at times, because I just can't figure out what is motivating this push.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Inez.
No, it'll be part of tie in the same concepts, because both of you are referencing sort of the positive history or legal history of women's equality. And I'm wondering if this is not, or how you would distinguish, for example, a case like VMI, Virginia versus the United States, from, because it seems to me that this regime, particularly with regard to the military, is the logical consequence then of this VMI case that said that, for example, a military academy cannot admit only men, or that it's a logical consequence of, in fact, allowing women into combat positions, that if some, there's also some percentage of men, right, who are ineligible and eligible for combat. And just because the percentages are different, whether it's psychological, as the folks that Jennifer was referencing think that maybe we can just overcome the biological sex distinction by sheer whatever,
Covering
feeling,
your ears if I can't listen.
Yeah.
Pretending.
How I guess, again, how do you distinguish between if it's, if, for example, we can't have, it's unconstitutional under VMI to have an all-male military academy, and we must, in order to have legal equality for men and women must be admitted to those spaces. How then is it not fair to say, well, if you want the upsides, deal with the downsides. Now you got to play with the boys everywhere.
Yeah, I also always thought that this case was not the best case law. I do not feel that the reasoning is consistent with intermediate scrutiny. It always felt like it tracked really much more. For the VMI case, that it tracked more closely with like strict scrutiny. I think this is the one, I hope I'm not wrong about this, but where there's a Rehnquist concurrence, where there was something where basically says, concurred in result, but not in reasoning, where he said, essentially, it's a fact-specific case, which is really more in line with something intermediate scrutiny for something like this. He said, the truth is there isn't anything and couldn't be anything comparable to VMI for women in terms of like rigor and prestige and everything. So he seemed to feel that for him, that was where that case was decided, as opposed to the majority, which was more like loosey-goosey, including, Ginsburg about, just, oh yes, and we have to, and it's equal and everything else. So I always just felt like that case was really inconsistent with the rest of case law. And I'm not a Supreme Court scholar enough to know why that might be, but I would say it's a logical consequence of the strict scrutiny analysis that I feel was snuck in the back door there.
Yeah, I'm also not inclined to defend that decision, to be honest. I think, a lot of us who are radical feminists have experienced this journey from liberal feminism, where we've had to look back and question some of our prior assumptions. And some of those include some of these cases that are about equality that just sort of give you a good feeling. And it, I always had an inkling of discomfort, like this, it didn't really set with me. And I think there are women who, really listen to that inkling of discomfort, and it grows louder and louder when you start to talk about prisons and bathrooms and things like this, and recognizing the differences between men and women in that context. But then there are women who really just sort of double down, cover their ears, cover their eyes, and I just don't think that I can. I'm not sure if I, looking back at the VMI case, I'm not sure that I think I would feel at a minimum very conflicted, and I would probably personally lean against the outcome, and part of that is just having 2020 retrospective vision and seeing now how it's being used. But at this point, with all of these developments in this area and in the gender identity area, I'm just very, very, I'm more conservative, sort of in the small c sense, in the sense of just being very suspicious about any kind of risk that, increased risk that women would face under the guise of being equal or under the guise of equity.
So let me just sort of deviate from that a little bit. We talked at the beginning about how the Supreme Court decided not to address the issue of whether an all-male selective service today violates the Equal Protection Clause. Were they to take that up, they would have to reconsider some of the things we're talking about here. What does intermediate scrutiny mean? Did the VMI case slip strict scrutiny in through the back door? And should we continue to treat women under a different constitutional standard than men? All of those questions would be things they would have to address. And so they essentially told Congress to deal with it. If this is something that's inevitable, and I'm not saying that it is, isn't it better from our standpoint as people who care about the rights of women to have Congress do this as opposed to having the Supreme Court set a really terrible precedent that, for example, applies strict scrutiny to government decisions that treat men and women differently, and treating men and women exactly the same for constitutional purposes, because that would have repercussions in so many other areas. Whereas if Congress just says, okay, we're going to require women to register for the Selective Service, that's over here in this little bucket, and that's a policy decision. But if the Supreme Court were to make that same decision, well, then you're opening up the whole can of worms. Single-sex prisons are gone. Single-sex sports are gone. Single-sex bathrooms are gone. All of the above.
The same list of issues. Every one of these, every time we talk about this issue, whether it's in the Selective Service context, draft context, whether it's the ERA, whether it's dealing with trans athletes, it's the same box of issues. It's those areas where sex differences matter.
Yeah, but I'm trying to figure out whether I should actually be happy about Justice Sotomayor's statement. I mean, how should conservatives feel about it? I mean, did she do us a favor by putting the ball back in Congress's court rather than allowing the Supreme Court to establish, a bright line permanent rule? Maybe she did. I don't know. I just want to throw that out there.
Well, I think it gives Congress the opportunity to build a strong factual record under whatever it's doing, so that if Congress passes a law and that is subject to scrutiny, then at least there's a factual record there, and it's not all being decided in the abstract. That said, that commission report really gave me a lot of heartburn, because it seemed to gloss over a lot of really important issues and a lot of important facts relevant to just the nature of the draft, the nature of combat service. There are I think Justice Sotomayor's statement starts out with a lot of inspirational recitation of women's expanded involvement in the military today. And I have, looking into the background of this issue, I was persuaded by some of the information that the Independent Women's Forum has presented in the past that, that's not the same. All combat is not equal, I guess, and all women's military service is not equal, and that just because women have made tremendous strides voluntarily in serving doesn't mean that across the board a draft of women for combat service is the right direction to go in. And so that I would think that if Congress wanted to retain the restriction of the draft to men, then this would be a good chance for them to put together a solid factual case. But I also worry about what kind of other, really unhelpful stuff might enter the record as well. Mm. Yeah, but I mean, I want to wholeheartedly agree that any risk of putting questions of sex discrimination across the board under strict scrutiny would just be an absolute disaster for women's rights. I mean, that would the consequences which were down for decades, we'd be untangling that legislatively and through court cases. It would be a very blunt instrument, and Congress approving registration could be a much more narrow action, and it could be potentially limited to certain circumstances, or so I think if the Supreme Court takes it up, I'm not encouraged by it's really hard to get away from the gender identity issue. I try not to be a one-note band on the issue, but everything really does come back to that. And of course, the Supreme Court ruling in the in the employment case, the funeral home case, good golly, that was the reasoning in that was just so bad, and coming from a conservative appointed justice. So my hope would be that this stays far away from the Supreme Court for now.
We actually have an At the Bar on episode on that issue and on that case. If if anyone is interested in going back, and for the non-legal eagles in the audience, strict scrutiny would essentially place sex differences on the same level as race. So think about anything that would be forbidden in terms of discrimination on the basis of race, apply it to sex. So that's what we're talking about, just for folks who are not as steeped in legal standards as our guest today, Jennifer Chavez, Wolf Advisor, Lauren Adams, Legal Director of Wolf. Thank you, ladies, both for coming on At the Bar and for building bridges across ideological boundaries here. I think we're all very interested in making sure that American women retain a lot of their what I would view as a very privileged position in terms of having equal rights to men and equality under the law, without losing sight of the fact that if we ignore those sex differences, they're going to come back to bite us. Jennifer, you want to say anything before we sign off here?
No, that's it. Thank you all for joining us. At the Bar is a production of Independent Women's Forum. It's available for viewing on Facebook, YouTube, and IWF.org, and is also now available for download on all of your favorite podcast apps: iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and others. We hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks. See you at the bar.
See you at the bar.
Cheers.